The haunting at Olympic National Park. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a chance to escape the noise and chaos of our daily lives. Just me, my wife, and our 2 kids. We had always loved the outdoors, always found peace in the vastness of the wild. So when we decided to spend a few days in Olympic National Park, I thought it would be perfect. What I didn't know, though, was that we weren't just walking into the woods. We were walking into something much darker, something that would stay with us forever. The rain had been falling in a steady rhythm, heavy and unrelenting, for nearly 2 days straight. The air was thick with moisture, the ground muddy and slippery beneath our boots. It wasn't ideal camping weather, but it didn't matter. We'd been looking forward to this for months, and nothing was going to ruin our weekend. We found a quiet spot near a river, tucked away in a small clearing. The trees stretched high above us, their thick canopy forming a natural shelter from the rain. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the air as we set up our tent. My wife, Lisa, and our daughter, Emma, worked on getting the campfire going, while I sorted through our supplies. By the time we had the fire crackling, it had stopped raining, though the sky remained overcast, the gray clouds lingering like an old memory. The night fell quickly, and soon we were gathered around the fire, the only sound being the occasional snap of burning wood. Felt peaceful, quiet like it should, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't anything I could point to, but it was there, a vague unease that seemed to hang in the air, an uncomfortable sensation that made the fire feel smaller, like it was struggling to hold back the darkness. "Dad, what's that?" Emma's voice broke through my thoughts. I turned to look at her. She was staring down at the ground near the edge of the campfire's light. My heart skipped a beat when I saw what she was pointing at. There were footprints, fresh, still visible in the mud. "Are those ours?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I stood up, stepping cautiously toward the prints. They were too large to be Emma's, too uneven to be Lisa's. They were definitely not mine, and they were nowhere near the fire. I glanced around, a knot tightening in my stomach. The tracks led off into the trees, toward the dense thicket that bordered the clearing. "Stay here," I said to Lisa, trying to sound calm, though my voice felt foreign in my own mouth. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the edge of the clearing. I scanned the forest, my pulse quickening as the beam of light swept over the damp ground. The footprints continued, disappearing into the underbrush. "Dad, where are you going?" Emma's voice was small but filled with concern. "I'll be right back. Stay close to Mom." I didn't want to scare them, but my instincts were telling me something wasn't right. Those prints didn't belong to anyone in our group. I followed the trail for a few yards, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with fog, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, like the earth was pulling me deeper into the woods. Then I heard something, a rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, a shift in the underbrush, a subtle crack of a twig snapping. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I held my breath, waiting, trying to listen through the pounding of my own heartbeat. "Hello," I called out, my voice hoarse and uncertain. No response, just the low whisper of the wind through the trees. I waited a beat longer, then turned back toward the camp. But as I did, I caught a glimpse of something, a figure, half hidden among the shadows, barely visible in the dim light of the flashlight. I stopped. My blood ran cold. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a man. His clothes were dark, soaked from the rain, and he was facing away from me, almost as if he were trying to blend into the forest. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his presence, like something unnatural. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling now. The man didn't move. He didn't respond. I took a step forward, my stomach churning. "Hello," I called again, my voice louder this time. Still nothing. Something in my gut told me to stay back, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. A terrible tension filled the air. I felt like I was caught in a trance, unable to look away from the figure standing just outside the camp's light. "Are you lost?" I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. At that moment, the man shifted slightly. He turned just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were wide, glassy, almost vacant, and yet there was something sharp about them, something wrong. I'm lost," he muttered. His voice was shaky, like he was trying to keep it steady, but something kept slipping through. "I've been out here for days. I need help." I felt the first prickles of fear worming their way into my spine. There was something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes darted around as if he couldn't focus, that made my skin crawl. His words didn't match his demeanor, and it didn't feel right. "We'll help you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come back to our camp with me." He nodded slowly, almost too slowly, as if considering whether to trust me. Then he started walking toward me, but something was wrong. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the way he moved, or the way the fog seemed to cling to him, but I suddenly felt like I was standing in the presence of something I didn't understand, something I shouldn't be around. I took a step back, reaching for my phone in my pocket, and that's when I heard the voice behind me. "Is everything okay?" I turned around to see Lisa standing a few feet away, Emma clutching her side. They'd followed me. The man stopped immediately, his eyes flickering toward them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, more desperate. I need help, please." But this time, I didn't believe him. Something in my gut told me to get my family out of there, and fast. I looked at Lisa, and she must have seen it in my eyes because she didn't ask any questions. We turned to leave, but just as we started walking back toward the camp, the man spoke again. "You can't leave," he said, his voice low and eerie. "You're not going anywhere." I didn't turn around. Couldn't. My body was already in motion, pushing forward, dragging my family along with me. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard the man's footsteps behind us. When we reached the camp, I didn't even stop to grab the supplies. I didn't even look back. I just threw everything into the car, told Lisa to get Emma inside, and drove as fast as I could out of that cursed forest. We didn't stop until we were out of the park, and we didn't talk about it. Not then, not ever. But I know what I saw, and I know what we felt. Something was wrong in that forest, something that didn't belong there. And to this day, I don't know what would have happened if we had stayed. Story number 2. The disappearance at Laurel Hill. I never imagined that a simple camping trip could turn into something like this. And yet, here I am, writing this down, the whole thing still replaying in my mind, every detail sharp and clear. They say when you experience something that shakes you to the core, you can never forget it. They say it haunts you. They're right. It all started on a cold, drizzly morning in October, when my wife, Rachel, and I decided to get away for a weekend in the woods. We'd been to Laurel Hill State Park in Pennsylvania a few times before. It was peaceful, quiet, exactly what we needed after a few months of city life and work stress. Just the two of us, a small tent, some campfire food, and a promise to forget about everything else. Rachel and I were no strangers to camping. We'd spent plenty of nights in tents, cooking marshmallows, telling stories, and just enjoying the simple life. It was our escape. So when the forecast called for rain, we didn't think twice. We packed up our gear, drove out into the woods, and set up camp just off the beaten path. Near the edge of a quiet stream, the sound of the water, mixed with the steady patter of rain on the leaves, was comforting, almost soothing. The night came quickly. The rain continued to fall, heavier now. As we huddled around the campfire, we shared a bottle of wine and talked about everything and nothing, old memories, plans for the future, the usual. There was something magical about those nights, something that made me feel closer to her than ever before. We settled into our tent late that evening, tired but content. The rain had turned into a steady, persistent downpour, the kind that makes you feel safe, trapped inside a warm sleeping bag, with the world outside cold and distant. I remember Rachel saying something about the rain being nice, how it felt like a cocoon, how we were safe from everything. I agreed, and we fell asleep, wrapped in each other's warmth. But I didn't stay asleep for long. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. The rain had lessened, but the air was thick, and the world felt off strange, almost like it had shifted in the night. My heart raced as I listened. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing at the canvas of the tent. But then the sound came again. Soft, deliberate footsteps, barely a whisper. Someone was out there. I nudged Rachel, but she didn't stir. The footsteps continued. I lay there for a long moment, paralyzed, unsure what to do. Should I get up? Should I check? My thoughts spun in frantic circles. Finally, I decided I couldn't stay in that tent, not with whatever it was outside. I slowly unzipped the flap, peering out into the dark woods. The moonlight cut through the trees, casting shadows that seemed to shift and move. I saw nothing, not a soul, not even the slightest movement. I stepped out of the tent, heart hammering. I called Rachel's name, but she didn't answer. I figured she was still asleep. But as I walked around the campsite, something caught my eye. One of the ropes securing the tent had been pulled loose. The flap was slightly ajar. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Something was off. Something had happened in the night that I couldn't explain. I rushed back inside, shaking Rachel awake. Her eyes fluttered open, but she seemed disoriented. "What's wrong?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "I don't know," I said, but I could feel the unease building inside me. "I think someone was out there." Rachel's face was pale. "Are you sure?" "Yeah, I heard something. Footsteps. And the tent. It's not the way we left it." We both stood in the dim light of the tent, listening. The rain had stopped, but the world felt too still, too quiet. I looked out at the woods again, but there was no sign of life. Nothing moving, nothing breathing. I stayed up for hours after that, unable to sleep. Rachel fell back to sleep easily, her breathing slow and steady, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. Morning came, but it didn't feel like morning. It was a gray, heavy light, the air thick with fog and dampness. I shook Rachel awake, but she didn't respond. "Rachel," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. "Come on, wake up." She didn't move. I shook harder, panic rising in my chest. "Rachel, please, wake up." I stared at her face, my breath shallow, my mind racing. Her eyes were closed, but something was wrong. Her skin looked pale, too pale. I reached out and touched her arm, but there was no warmth. The blood drained from my face as I realized Rachel wasn't breathing. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at her, willing her to wake up, to move, to tell me this was all a bad dream. But it wasn't. It was real. I ran out of the tent, screaming her name, as if calling her could somehow bring her back. I ran to the edge of the camp, into the woods, yelling for help that no one could hear. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know if she had been taken, if something had happened to her in the night, or if it was something worse. The only thing I knew for sure was that she was gone. I spent the rest of the day searching the woods. Hours passed. The rain started again, soaking me through, but I didn't care. I needed to find her. I needed to know what had happened. But all I found were the footprints, strange. Large footprints in the wet ground, leading toward the creek. They didn't make sense. They didn't match any human form I had ever seen. As the light started to fade, I found myself back at the campsite, alone. The night had fallen, and with it came the same eerie silence that had gripped me the night before. But now it was deeper, darker, and colder. That was when I saw it, the tent, half collapsed, as though someone had been inside, the ropes that had been undone, the fabric torn. I crawled inside and found nothing but the remnants of our things scattered around. There was no trace of Rachel, only the cold, wet echo of the forest. as if it had swallowed her whole. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting, hoping, but no one came. No search party, no sign of Rachel. In the days that followed, the search continued, but there was nothing, no trace of Rachel anywhere. It was like she had vanished into thin air. To this day, I don't know what happened in those woods, or what took my wife. I don't know if it was someone or something that took her, but I do know that Laurel Hill is not the peaceful place it once was. It's a place I'll never return to, and every year, when the rain falls, I think of Rachel, and I wonder if I'll ever get an answer, but I doubt I ever will. Story number 3. The Burley Lake Nightmare. The rain had been relentless when we first arrived at Burley Lake. It wasn't exactly the ideal weather for camping, but we were desperate to escape the noise of the city, desperate for that rare thing we could never seem to find, peace. Me, my brother Ben, and our 2 closest friends, Mark and Sarah, all of us looking for something simple, the silence of the wilderness, a few beers, and the feeling of being away from everything. We were used to camping, so the cold drizzle, the wet ground, and the smell of pine weren't exactly obstacles. As long as we had a fire, a good tent, and each other's company, the weather didn't matter, or at least, that's what I thought. We set up camp near the edge of the lake, a secluded spot just far enough from the main trail that it felt like we were truly alone in the woods. The trees stood tall around us, their branches heavy with rain, casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find peace. It was dark, thick with trees, and there was always the feeling that something was just out of sight. The fire crackled and popped, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy silence of the forest. We drank and joked, making light of the rain and the mess it had created. It wasn't until later that night, when the wind started to pick up and the rain turned to a steady downpour, that things started to feel wrong. Around midnight, we were all huddled in our tents, trying to sleep. The sound of the storm outside was deafening, but it wasn't the weather that woke me up. No, it was the noise from the woods. It was faint at first, just a rustle in the distance, like something large moving through the underbrush. I tried to ignore it. The wind was picking up, branches were swaying, and there was no telling what could have caused the sounds. But then I heard it again, this time, closer, a slow, deliberate crunching, like someone stepping through the wet leaves. It was too regular, too precise to be the wind or an animal, and it was moving closer to our camp. I held my breath, listening. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced over at Ben's tent. He was asleep, his breathing steady, unaware of what I was hearing. Mark and Sarah's tents were still, too. I told myself it was just the storm, just the rain, and the way the wind made the trees creak and groan. But the sound continued, the footsteps coming closer and closer, until I was sure someone was out there, and they were circling our camp. I slipped out of my sleeping bag and crawled to the tent flap, careful not to make a sound. My hands trembled as I unzipped it just enough to peek outside. The fire was barely aglow now, casting long, eerie shadows, but the trees were silent. The noise had stopped. It was like the world had held its breath. I waited, my eyes straining to see anything moving, but there was nothing, just the rain, the trees, and the shadowy shapes of the forest. I was starting to think I had imagined it when I heard something else. A soft thud, like someone dropping something heavy. That was it. I couldn't wait any longer. I shook Ben awake, whispering urgently in his ear. He was groggy at first, but when I told him about the noises, his expression hardened. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear I felt creeping up my spine. We didn't wake Mark and Sarah right away. We didn't want to cause a panic, but we started to gather our things, quietly as possible, keeping our eyes on the dark forest surrounding us. We were convinced now, someone or something was out there, watching us. We weren't alone. Just as we were about to make a run for it, I noticed something in the corner of my eye, a figure, standing at the edge of the camp. It was tall, too tall, and it wasn't moving. I could barely make it out through the rain, but the outline of it, dark, unnatural, was enough to make my blood run cold. I froze, holding my breath. My mind raced. Was it a person? A bear? A shadow? My heart was in my throat as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could react, the figure moved just a slight shift, and then it was gone. I turned to Ben, and the look on his face said everything. He had seen it too. We bolted, rushing to Mark and Sarah's tents, shaking them awake. Mark was groggy, but Sarah shot up immediately, her eyes wide. They knew something was wrong before we even told them. It wasn't just the rain that felt off. It wasn't just the wet ground or the damp clothes. Something was out there, and we didn't want to find out what. We packed up in a frenzy, our hands shaking as we shoved things into bags, trying to make as little noise as possible. The storm had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than the rain. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. We didn't speak much as we hurried to pack up. The only sound was the frantic rustling of the tents, the crunch of wet gear being shoved into bags. The night air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to move with us. By the time we were ready to leave, the camp was eerily quiet, too quiet. The only sound was our footsteps on the wet ground, and even those seemed muffled. We didn't look back. We couldn't, and as we made our way toward the trail, we realized that the only thing that kept us from losing it entirely was the thought of getting away, just getting out of there. When we finally reached the parking lot, we didn't stop. We didn't even talk. We just piled into the truck and drove, not caring where we were going, as long as it wasn't back to that damn lake. The next day, we went back to Burley Lake, with the sheriff in tow, to see what we could find. But there were no signs of anyone, no footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing. It was as if the figure had never been there at all. The camp was still set up, as though we had never left. But we knew what we had heard, what we had seen. The woods had been watching us, and we never went camping again. Not at Burley Lake, not anywhere. Some things you just don't mess with. Some things are better left alone, because once you step into their world, there's no going back.